Hi, everyone, and welcome to our next episode of Interviews with Foucauldians. Today, I am here with Perry Zurn. Perry, thank you for chatting with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you don't mind, I would like you to introduce yourself, your affiliation, and say just one or two things about the areas in philosophy and the humanities that you specialize in.
Sure. I'm currently an assistant professor of philosophy at American University. I use he, him pronouns. And I specialize, I would say, I focus on social and political philosophy, broadly construed. So my work tends to be interdisciplinary. And I'm interested specifically in understanding how change happens. So how does change happen in ourselves? How does it happen between people? How does it happen in societies? And to answer this, I'm focusing on theorizing change, but in conjunction with histories of change and archives of change.
And what comes to mind when you think about archives of change? I'm just curious about that phrase.
Yeah, so for me at least, I focus a lot on histories of activism or instances of social activism where change actually happens and or change is being sought. And so what can we learn? How is change already being theorized there and practiced there and demonstrated there? And what can we learn there as theorists?
Okay, great. And so one of the figures that you work on and have published extensively about is Michel Foucault. And so I want the first question to be a general but still semi-targeted question about what you find useful about Foucault for your purposes. So what aspect of the Foucauldian corpus, so if we think here from his earliest writings all the way to the end, what part of it do you find most appealing, and what has it allowed you to do intellectually?
Yeah, so there's a lot about Foucault that I like. I'm very interested. I really appreciate the way in which he follows his curiosity. So, and curiosity comes up in other forms of my work, but he's really willing to try out new areas of thought, new disciplines, new practices, new topics, and he's always kind of moving and changing and responding to his curiosities, and that's inspiring for me as a theorist. So, in that sense, his whole body of work inspires me and kind of activates my own interests. I like the bravery there. I like the not needing to demonstrate one's loyalty to a particular method or a particular discipline or a particular topic. He's not one of these, I just do this one thing. He's one of these, I do all these things.
Yeah.
And I love that. I think that's pretty great. And, you know, as far as, I guess I also more personally, I appreciate him as a queer ancestor of sorts for academics. I love that he was a queer man and thought about that in so many unsuspected ways, I think, at the time, and brought that part of his life into his work. And I want to be that kind of integrated intellectual. So those are the broad stroke reasons why I like Foucault and why I'm influenced by Foucault. And then the more focused would be, I've worked most with Discipline and Punish and with surrounding text around the early to mid 1970s in Foucault's work, and thought a lot about his work on prisons and on punishment and on some nascent theorizations of abolition at the time, things like that.
And your own work, you've contributed to a rising field called curiosity studies. So thinking about Foucault's own curiosity and your work on curiosity, I want to return to that later in the interview. So I want to sort of put a little tag on it. And you've also written about questions related to sex and gender and trans philosophy. And so there's also that clear connection, for example, with Foucault's writings in the history of sexuality, which I think you're right, it's such a novel and refreshing way of thinking about sexuality, especially in the 1970s. I've been reading it recently, and it just reminds me of why I fell in love with it when I was an undergrad. And it reminds me of how wrong I was in my earliest readings just about how complex that book actually is.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
beautiful book.
it's wonderful, and it's tricky, and it's really enriching. And just for some context, my students will have already read this book, so they have this in the back of their mind. But I want to begin now with the reference that you made to Foucault's Discipline and Punish, because you've published a couple of works on the nature of Foucault's engagement with the abolition movement, prison reform. You published a book in 2016 entitled Active Intolerance, Michel Foucault, the Prisons Information Group, and the Future of Abolition, which you co-edited with Andrew Diltz. And so I want us to talk a little bit about that book. So can you say what this book argues, or what the motivation for this book is in the grand scheme of things, and why think about Foucault's work in relation to prisons from the 1970s in 2016 in our sort of historical present?
Yeah. Gosh, these questions are so rich. I mean, on the in the very broadest of strokes, I think this book comes out of a commitment to think about the histories of activism or change, and how they can inform and teach us about activism today and change today. So, and this comes out of participating in activism myself, but also mentoring young activists. There's often a kind of an isolation from the histories of change that could teach us so many things about what works, about what doesn't work, that things that help us be reflective about our practice. And so I think in general, really uncovering and appreciating and working through our histories of change is critical for our present moment. So that's just a broad stroke why, for, in a sense, for change or for activism. But there's also a theory reason, which is that this is a beautiful instance of when theory has come from practice, come out of practice, come after practice. In the case of Foucault, he publishes Discipline and Punish in 1975, and in that he says, there's a clear moment in the introduction that points back to this is coming out of or from or after these years of prison resistance work. And most people in the early reception of that book simply focus on it as a book of theory. Out of thin air, here we are, Foucault weighing in on prisons, and not really tracing back and appreciating that much of what he's bringing forward are ideas generated in community and in collaboration with people who were formerly or at the time currently incarcerated, as well as other intellectuals at the time. So it's a product of collaborative, community-oriented and engaged thought and practice. And that matters to me to change how we think about theory at all, and Foucault's theory in particular, I suppose.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the questions that I typically get whenever I teach Foucault, it grows out of this anxiety that some readers of Foucault, my students, sometimes have about getting left trapped in this system of power relations that closes in on all sides, right? The Foucauldian house of language, the house of discourse. And the question that I always get is, what's the way out of this? What's one mode of resistance? And I always say for that, you really do have to think about Foucault not just as a writer, not just in his function as an intellectual who published this book, but also at his engagement. And this is clearly one of them. And so for our listeners, viewers who may not know about Foucault's engagement with prison reform, especially in the French context of the 1970s, can you say a little bit about the Prisons Information Group? Only because I know you've written extensively about it, and so you are the expert on this connection between Foucault's writings about Discipline and Punish and his engagement with this group that he helped found in 1970, 1971.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you indicated, the Prisons Information Group began, there were some inklings of it forming in the early 1970s, and then it really formalizes in the late 1970s. And it lasts, I mean, there's some disagreement over when it sort of lasts, or when it ends. It ends in either 1972, 1973. And it ends actually by giving way to a new group that kind of comes out of it and sort of takes over, takes the baton, and it's the Prisoners' Action Committee. What distinguishes the two groups is that the Prison's Information Group was really generated and led by French intellectuals, Foucault specifically, really working closely with his partner Daniel Defer, Gilles Deleuze, Hélène Cixous, Sartre was involved, like sort of this collection of folks, Jean Genet. And then the committee, the Prisoners' Action Committee, is led by former prisoners, especially Liv Rosé. It was one of the guys who really heads it off, and who was really, really close friends with Foucault. So the Prison's Information, that's when it started, when it kind of ended because it passed its legacy on. But its goal, as you can tell from the title, the Prison's Information Group, was to get information about what was happening in the prisons, to get information about it from prisoners themselves, and then to get it out, to kind of illuminate this space. And you could think about this in relationship to the language of problematization, the way Foucault uses it in various works. So I think we can say that the Prison's Information Group problematizes the prison. That's what it's trying to do, is actively taking this site as a new, a necessary, a compelling focus of questions, of inquiry, of investigation, right? It shouldn't be something that just falls under the blanket of everyday life, but it needs to be brought up and addressed.
And one of the things that I found very useful about your work on the subject is that you point out that not only does the group problematize the prison as an institution, but it problematizes it in a very specific way by construing and characterizing and portraying the prison under the category or the concept of the intolerable, as that which reaches or violates a threshold of human or moral or political tolerability. And I want you to say a few things about that word, just because it seems to play a pretty important role, not just in the work of the group itself, but also in your own thinking about what it means to be a critic of the prison today.
Yeah, so yeah, the word intolerable is a very thematic word in the archive of this particular organization, the Prison's Information Group. It was both theorized and simply became part of the water, one could say, of the group itself. The prison as intolerable. And in stating that it is intolerable, there's a number of things that are happening. One is it is experienced, it is affectively experienced as intolerable by incarcerated people. And it's also judged as intolerable. So when you think about what is it doing, what is the prison doing, and what is it failing to do, the thing that it's doing is not improving prisoners, not improving society. And in fact, inflicting a kind of restriction on freedom that doesn't has no real purchase in the realm of a better social world. And so in that sense, it's intolerable. But I think it's also important to indicate that it's not only the feeling of it as being intolerable for incarcerated people at the time was not just basic things like being regularly beat up or thrown into solitary for no good reason, or this kind of abuse of power, restrictions on heating or on food or on medical care, just really the denial of human health and sociality in a space. That's felt as intolerable. But it's also a conception of what a much more what does it take to, what does one owe? What does a society owe to a human being who has failed in some social sense, or who is simply the product of a machine of kind of targeting minor transgressions of social order, right? What does a society owe? And in a lot of cases, they're just saying this isn't the thing that a society owes.
Yeah, and it's a long history when thinking about the prison of that question sometimes not even registering as legible in relation to the community of prisoners, right? Because of the putative failure of the prisoner to have lived up to the standards or the expectations of the social contract, then the assumption is that all bets are off, right? This is why it makes something like prisoner rights such an unpopular, let's say, item when you're thinking about politics in the electoral sense, right? Very few people are standing up for rights of prisoners. And one of the things that's so interesting about Foucault's writings about this transition from one kind of, one modality of power in the 16th century to a new modality of power in Discipline and Punish, is that he says, we tell this story that the birth of the prison was an achievement of humanism, and it was a moral victory as we moved away from methods of torture. But there's a really wonderful line where he says, the prison didn't emerge so that we could punish less. It emerged so that we could punish more profusely. So it's actually to punish more, because suddenly it reaches, again, as you point out, to those very fundamental dimensions of human life, of what it means to flourish in the most minimal sense. And it seems like the prison makes it very difficult, and you've written about this.
Yeah, and I think part of what's happening in Discipline and Punish, so I think we can understand the prison's information group as problematizing the prison in the sense of pointing it out as a necessary locus of new attention, or a new kind of attention. But I think Discipline and Punish problematizes in a different way by demonstrating doing a history or a genealogy of how did prison become an object that has a kind of role in society that's unique to the modern period.
So I want to ask you a question that is about your own position as an academic writing about the prison. And the reason that I bring it up is because it was a question that was raised within the prison's information group, and that led to really this transition that you talk about from the GIG to the PAC, where you have a movement that is led primarily by intellectuals to a movement that is led primarily by prisoners themselves. And so in the context of the 1970s, early 1970s, there is this question, and it's a philosophical and it's a political question, which is, what does it mean to let academics be the voice of prison reform? Because there is a risk here of speaking for others, of misconstruing an experience to which we may not have access. And so I'm wondering whether you can help us think through this question, because one of the criticisms that has been made of academic-driven movements for prison reform is that they reflect the values of the academics that sort of spearhead them.
Yeah. The first thing I want to say is to sort of clarify that I don't understand the Prisons Information Group as a movement of reform. In many cases, they explicitly distance themselves from a reform movement, and in calling themselves the Prisons Information Group, they're signaling that. And one of the things that I've argued is that, in fact, because of the emphasis on information and the importance of voice from the voice of prisoners being those who weigh in on what the prison is about and what should or should not be happening, that movement to centralize prisoners' voices in the problematization of the prison is an abolitionist movement. So just sort of a clarification, my reading of the JIP is as an abolitionist movement and not a reform movement. But your point about, or your question about the role of academics in weighing in on these issues is so important, and it was crucial to the JIP. I think that in many cases, what I appreciate so much about the work that they did was the practice of listening, or the practices of listening as academics to voices and theorizations other than their own, and then to work in allyship to lift those voices and those theorizations into places that they would not otherwise go because of the structures of power over systems of information. So I see that as a very worthwhile practice, and one that if we're going to be academics talking about issues of contemporary import, many times we will be talking about groups that we may not be a part of. And we need to think about how to do that accountably, and to simply avoid talking about those issues because we're not a part of that group is to wash our hands of something that we may be guilty of, in a sense, of participating in a society that lives on and through incarceration. That's part of what ours does. So that's some of the ways I would sort of address that.
Yeah, and I'm very glad that you brought up this issue about hand washing, because there is this sense in which sometimes under the umbrella of not wanting to speak for others, we end up not speaking at all. And it does seem like there's an abrogation of responsibility in a very fundamental sense there that can happen. And one could even draw a connection here between this ethos of listening that you're mentioning and Foucault's very methodology in relation to the archive, where one of the things that he wants to do in all of his genealogies is sort of listen to the murmur of these forgotten voices, these infamous men and women that have been in some ways kept in the historical record, but only as the detritus of the application of power. And so what does it mean to listen to them? And it seems like there is that, at least at a methodological level, there's a parallelism here between listening to those past murmurs and listening to those present day murmurs, which may be more than murmurs in many cases.
Yeah, and I think it's really helpful to pull that out, because I also think in his attention to what is past, he almost always says, and it's present now, so that when he's telling these histories or these genealogies, it's because they're histories of the present, and we're living out those constructions or configurations of power and resistance today. It's not as if it's for him ever really separate, the past and the present. And in the same way, I think we need to think about incarceration this way, that one might think that one is separate from the prison system, that it has never touched one's life, and yet if you dig even a little bit, it's going to have affected someone in your family directly. It's going to be something for me as a trans person, it affects my community, incarceration. So there's a lot of targeting and punishment and policing and incarceration and mistreatment of trans people in prisons. And so I think if you think a little bit, you realize that this thing that's seems like it's out there and separate from academia, for example, or from any one scholar, in fact, it's already here. It's already in us in some way. And that's part of why I think I feel called to work accountably with those things.
And I mean, one of the mistakes that we tend to make when thinking about these, as Foucault says, heterotopic spaces like the prison or the military camp or the clinic, is to assume that just because they have a specific spatial arrangement, that they are contained entirely within that arrangement. And what you're suggesting is that, in fact, the prison may be encapsulated in the prison building, but in fact, as a system of power, it sort of throws down roots and spreads across the social body. And I think you're exactly right that if any of us ponder the question enough, we find a direct connection, whether that be somebody in our social network that has been entangled in the prison industrial complex, or somebody that should have but didn't for markers such as class and race, right? Should have in the sense of like technically would have ended up entangled had it not been because of white privilege, class privilege, male privilege, etc. Or in this case, you also mentioned cis privilege. And so I actually want to transition to that topic because you published an article in Philosophia, a feminist journal that specializes on European philosophy, in which you talk about the issue and the problematic of gender non-conforming prisoners. And so I want you to say just more about that, because I know several of my students are interested in the subject of the way in which gender and sexuality and identity operate within the prison itself. And so I want you to say something about your work in this area.
Sure. Well, that specific piece, I'm talking about anonymity and the ways in which anonymity is, for many French theorists around Foucault's time and after, lauded as automatically a radical choice to choose not to have one's name and to act anyway. And this rings strangely coming from, if you're saturated in a gender nonconforming or trans community, because it's so rare to be given the name that is yours, right? It's in fact more of an act of resistance to hold on to your name, to say, no, this is my name, as opposed to I can just let go of my name, it's fine, I don't need a name. And so that, to me, that was a hinge by which to get into the question of how are names, how is anonymity and how is naming, how are these two things tactics that only become resistant in a particular relationship to an institutionalized formation that either has given a name or refuses a name.
And so in terms of the politics of the name and the politics of naming, there's this claim that you make about, let's call it the privilege of anonymity, right? The fact that anonymity can only be subversive for people who begin with a name that they can give up and sort of live the pleasure of that disappearance. But when the original struggle is different, then the meaning of that concept changes. And so how do you see that playing out specifically in the prison? This question of naming and the name within the boundaries of this institution.
Right. Well, I think that many trans people or gender nonconforming people are categorized as cisgender people, so named as cisgender people and placed in jail cells or prisons that reflect that kind of assignment. And in that sense, there's an erasure of their name. Mm-hmm. So that's just on the level of gender. And then that happens with respect to names themselves. So if a person has not legally changed their name, there's a refusal to acknowledge their chosen name. Mm-hmm. And in fact, to call it a criminal alias of some kind, which is precisely not what a trans person's name is. So those are two instances.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And so I want to make sure that we have time to talk about the other arm of your work, which has to do with curiosity studies. But I want to ask one last question about your work on prison abolition before making that transition. And that is that most of the work that you've produced, of course, is influenced by Foucault and his engagement and his writings about the history of the reform of the civil code in France over the course of the 1800s. And so the work has a French flavor. And so I'm wondering how you see, in the grand scheme of things, sort of stepping back as far as we can, the difference between the French setting of prison reform / prison abolition and the American setting. And so how should we think about the transportability of concepts, about the limit of concepts, or about the difference in the terrain that maybe calls arguably for different responses? So I'm just here wanting to hear about the French versus North American, specifically American setting.
Right. What's nice for the purposes of answering that question is simply to note that the Prisons Information Group was working with and inspired in many cases by prison resistance movements in Italy and the US at the time. So they're very aware of the Black Panthers, of things happening in Attica prison, and it shows up a lot in their writings, the Prisons Information Group writings. So there was already a conversation about sharing tactics and about in some cases, the different challenges of the regions. One that's very salient, of course, is the over-incarceration of Black Americans in the U.S. that is really unique in its own genealogy and in its present manifestation to the U.S. In comparison to France. But it's important to flag that race was not out of the question in the French resistance movement, prison resistance movement. But it was inflected differently. So there was there was more attention to immigration from Spain and Algeria and places like this. So an attention to how are immigrants in French system over-incarcerated, and an attention to class. There's a lot more attention to class in the French at that particular moment than there is today, for example, or even at that time in the US.
And if we take that, I mean, because I recall, for instance, Foucault's remarks about the rise of the prison and the layout of the prison and his notion of the panopticon. And then he says, you then have this design of just literally the way the prison looks in France, exported into the US and reflected in the first penitentiaries on this side of the Atlantic. So there is certainly a back and forth, not just of the master narrative, but as you point out, of the counter strategies with this dialogue between the Prison Information Group and, say, the Black Panthers. And so now if we switch the question from from space, France to the US, to time, 1970s to the present, again, in the grand scheme of things, are there things that you think have changed that maybe limit the usefulness or qualify the usefulness of this archive that you work on for the present moment specifically?
Well, first and foremost, incarceration has multiplied exponentially in both places since then. And this gave rise, for instance, to Liv Rosé, who continues to be alive today and sort of active and vocal, for him just saying, in that sense, the JIP or the Prisons Information Group failed because it's just worse. It's just, if we're taking 50 years into consideration, it's just worse than it was. And so in that case, maybe all of the tactics are limited or weren't beneficial to start with. That's one pessimistic way of
it is pessimistic.
And I think the other thing to think about is the rise of the digital age, such that that affects how policing works, that affects how incarceration actually works, and I think it has to affect how resistance works. And so it's not the same show up to the door of a prison and hand out flyers. I think we're in a different because we're in a different technological age, we will be in a different stage of resistance.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the principles of listening and of allyship and of problematizing a space that goes unnoticed and unspoken about, those hold.
No, that's great to think in terms of those fundamental commitments that we should retain as people committed to just the concept of justice in spite of the change in the terrain. And it seems like maybe one way, I'm going to try to make a smooth transition here, I don't know how great it will work. It seems like one of those values or principles would be a core curiosity about the experience of others, especially others whose narrative is often told for them without their import. And so this curiosity about the lived experience of people who fall through the cracks of these institutions of biopower and disciplinary power. And so I don't know how smooth that is, but then this leads us to your work on curiosity. And so you've published a book already in 2020, this year, which is called Curiosity Studies, and it gives it sort of carves out a place for you, an intervention in this growing field of curiosity studies that is arguably somewhat young. And you also have a forthcoming book with Danielle Bassett entitled Curious Minds, a neuroscientist and a philosopher tackle the mystery of how we know. And that should be coming out next year. And so for this, I want you to talk to me first and to my students about what curiosity studies is, period. I suspect many of them have never even heard the concept. And so what sorts of questions and what sorts of objects get tackled in curiosity studies?
Yeah, this it's tough because you're right that I've written a lot on curiosity, and so it's hard to put it all into, or to find a place to sort of begin. But I might start with I might actually start a little bit earlier with the dissertation. So when I wrote my dissertation on curiosity, and in it I have 2 chapters on Foucault and 2 chapters on Derrida, but the chapters on Foucault really point out that he thinks about curiosity as a way of resisting formations of knowledge by sort of poking holes in it and saying, what if we could think about this differently? But he also grants that there are certain institutionalized forms of asking questions and pursuing knowledge, such that curiosity lives in entrenched forms of power just as much as it lives in resistant acts and discourses. And I later formalized that in a piece called Curiosities at War, which does focus on the Prisons Information Group and Foucault and Rancière. But I think thinking about warring curiosities is really helpful, because it's not that institutions are incurious or never try to get new information. In fact, they're always getting new information. You can think about surveillance practices in policing as one of those cases of an institutionalized formation of curiosity. So curiosity isn't always radical, but it can be a kind of practice that opens up new ways of being, and that's certainly what Foucault found exciting about curiosity. So I am writing the book with Danielle Bassett on Curious Minds and neuroscience, and that's just super fun to write with someone that far from my wheelhouse. And we happen to be twins, so that's another reson why we're writing together.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a small detail.
It's also part of why it's so fun. So
okay.
Worth disclosing that. But one of the things, actually, the book that the dissertation sort of became, and it's far different than it ever was, but it's called Curiosity and Power, and that's coming out in April. And this is a roundabout way of answering your question. In Curiosity and Power, I'm interested in how our questions are constrained in advance. So they feel like there are questions. We feel when we're curious like we've stumbled upon something that interests us, that excites us, and yet the frameworks around which something can become exciting or can become a question are things that we inherit, things that are reinscribed by our social and cultural contexts. And what then is curiosity? There's this perception that it's this act of absolute freedom, right? I get to, it just bubbles out of me into the world, and then who knows what happens to it. But there's never that pure place that hasn't been informed by prior questions and by prior structures of information and knowledge.
And this seems almost like a Foucauldian, early Foucauldian framing of knowledge. I'm just here thinking about the notion of the episteme, of course, in the order of things. This notion that the space, the domain of truth and truth telling and truth speaking and truth making is already delimited. And so we might have a lot of freedom within that space, but again, there are very clear boundaries that are set by our historical period. So do you understand those boundaries that you're describing in relation to curiosity as historical in a Foucauldian sense, or do you understand them primarily, since I know that you're collaborating with a neuroscientist, as more natural, biological, neural boundaries?
I would avoid answering the question about whether there are neurological boundaries to what we know. Although I'm happy to sort of kick it to her and see what she would say. That would be fun. But they're at least historical, and they're at least social, and they're at least multiple. So, for example, I think I've inherited ways of asking questions just by being a white American. I think I've inherited ways by being an academic. So there are ways I ask questions precisely because I've been growing up in this disciplinary space, that specific disciplinary space. I think that there are ways that I ask questions or have inherited formations of curiosity based on my particular historical location in the trans-liberation movement. So I think the questions I could have asked 30 years ago are different than the ones I can ask 30 years from now. So there's a lot of embeddedness. I think part of what I'm arguing is that curiosity is always embedded. And then what does that mean? What do we do with that? So how do we then choose, how do we become aware of our curiosities or the formations? I like to talk about curiosity formations, and then how are we accountable about changing those or shifting those or listening to those?
And so in terms of this last comment that you just made, I am wondering, and I want to hear you talk about it. You identify these competing forms of curiosity, right? The curiosity of the master that wants to control an object versus a more open-ended curiosity that grows out of some of the ethos and the values that we discussed before. And it reminds me of Foucault's comments in the History of Sexuality, Volume 2, where he makes a similar comparison, where he says, that the point is to be curious, but not in this negative way. The point is to be curious in a way that you land in new places with your practice, with your thinking, with your mode of living. And so my question here is, how do we cultivate ourselves so that we end up exercising the right kind of curiosity? Because it is really a double-edged sword. So I worry about that curiosity that dissects, about that curiosity that kills, that pins down. And so I'm wondering, help me out here a little bit, Perry, about how to become an ethically curious subject.
Yeah, I think that's the big question. And despite the fact that the manuscript Curiosity and Power is, I'm done with it. It's coming out. I think it's still a question that I'm struggling with and dealing with and thinking about. So one of the things I do in the Curiosity and Power book is I characterize a specific curiosity formation, which I call the spectacle erasure formation. where specific marginalized groups, and I use the examples of the disability community and the trans community, specific groups become spectacularized such that they are kind of hyper visibilized in certain ways, but that spectacle is also an erasure, a refusal of attributing a depth of human personhood and sociality. So that's a way in which curiosity works. One institutional formation of curiosity that does this kind of, an attention that also refuses to listen. And I also develop, as a response, 3 ways of thinking about a more ethical formation of curiosity. And that would be a curiosity that is a companion to 3 things, I say. A companion to opacity. So willing to live with something I cannot, in fact, understand or see, instead of driving to master it and make it transparent. Then you might think of Glissant here. A companion to ambiguity, and I lean on Anzaldúa here, but a willingness to refuse that dissecting or that separating tendency to simply cut things into more and more pieces, and rather to say, I am attending to this and noticing I cannot separate these 2 things. And that form of curiosity that can sustain that, I think, is more ethical. And then the third is intimacy. A curiosity that is a companion to intimacy. And by that, I mean that so often curiosity does this, a problematic form of curiosity separates and pushes away and distances and creates an object, a curio. What would it mean to say we are already embedded in each other in, inter and intra-relational and beings with among ourselves as humans and the natural world? And what does curiosity then look like? Because it can't be a subject staring at an object. It can't. If we understand the world in this kind of intimate way. And there I'm leaning on certain indigenous forms of theory and philosophy. So I think those are 3, when we can find, in a sense, virtuous companions to curiosity, then I think we can start a different formation, a way of practicing curiosity differently.
That's beautifully put. And even the notion of companionship, right? The notion that curiosity is not alone. By itself, it's not sufficient, rather. Right. Precisely because of this inherent danger that it might go one way or the other. And so curiosity needs these friends, this intimacy, this, you mentioned opacity and ambiguity, as a way of developing a new kind of connection to difference and to sameness, perhaps as well, that then doesn't do the thing that let's call it molar, to use a Deleuzian term, the molar form of curiosity would do, which is this distancing, this cutting, and this assumption of absolute transparency, that I know who you are, perhaps better than you do, which is probably one of the most violent things that you can say or do to somebody, this notion. Perry, I think this is a perfect place on which to end. And there seems to be a very clear connection here too, in terms of your way of thinking about curiosity and Foucault's own approach to thinking about our present and about the past and how the past continues in the present. And I really want to thank you for taking the time to chat with me about this. And I may ask you for some resources afterwards to share with my students, especially about curiosity and the field of curiosity studies.
Sure.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right, bye-bye.